Thank you very much, Robin, for agreeing to talk to us today on the Let's Talk Education Africa podcast. And it's exciting that we are getting to talk about transforming teaching, education, and learning today. And we have the pleasure of the Executive Director of T-TEL to have this conversation with. You're welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you.
Yeah, before we jump right into the discussion, there may be people who are hearing your name for the first time, Robin, and I'll be interested in you telling us a bit about yourself and your background before we move into the discussion.
Sure. So my name is Robin Todd, and I'm originally from the UK. I first came to Ghana 23 years ago as a fresh graduate. I'd studied English and education at university, and I applied for voluntary service overseas, and I was posted in February 2000, to be an English teacher in Walewale Senior High School in what is now the northeast region of Ghana. So that was my first connection with Ghana. I spent 2.5 years teaching in the senior high school. At that time, it was a day school. It was quite hard to get teachers to come, so that's why they used to recruit VSA volunteers like me. And then from there, I did a master's degree in project planning, management and development. I spent 2.5 years in Nigeria running an NGO. I spent 5 years back working for the British government, working in the Department for Education, Department for Innovation, Universities and Skills, and then working finally in the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit under Gordon Brown, where I was responsible for adult education, apprenticeships, vocational training. Then the Labour government lost the election and I wasn't enjoying working for the civil service anymore. So I spent 2.5 years in Malawi running a large NGO microfinance company. And then I joined Cambridge Education in the UK and spent about 6 years working in ministries of education in countries like Tanzania, Uganda, Sierra Leone, Mozambique, helping them to improve the way that government delivers services. I mean, that's my passion really, is helping government deliver better education services and education outcomes. And then through the course of that work with Cambridge Education, I ended up coming to Ghana in October 2017 to run a program that Cambridge Education were running that was called T-TEL, Transforming Teacher Education and Learning. And I told my wife, my wife is a Ghanaian, by the way, but she lives with my children in the UK. So I told her that I was coming to Ghana for a year. And 6 years later, here I am, and we've been involved in setting up our own Ghanaian not-for-profit organization, which is the best job in the world I could ever imagine. And I found my home, I found my place in life, and I won't be leaving Ghana anytime soon.
No, that is really inspiring and lovely, also insightful. I'm particularly impressed about the breadth of your experience. I mean, being in Ghana 23 years ago, that should be around 2000, but also working across a wide range of geographies in different areas, and that is quite impressive. I can see from your introduction that Ghana has a special place in your heart. Getting into the discussion now, you have mentioned T-TEL, which was something you started working on under the Cambridge Education from 2017. I would be interested in you sharing the origins of T-TEL and what problems in education the organization seeks to address.
Yeah. So I think it's important that I talk about T-TEL, the project, and that will give some context for T-TEL, the organization, because even though the two things have a very similar name, they're actually quite different in outlook and then in function. So the T-TEL project, Stephen, in development, we have these kind of mega projects where USAID and then FCDO, the World Bank, provides a lot of money to try to solve issues. And those were the types of things I was working on with Cambridge Education. So in Ghana, the T-TEL project was designed to improve our pre-service teacher education system. And I think that was what was really interesting about the project. You see a lot of money is pumped in by donors, looking at in-service training, trying to improve the practices of teachers in the country. There are very few projects comparatively which are actually looking at changing how the way that we train teachers in the first place. And often that's because it's seen to be quite difficult and to do with institutions and structural reform. So T-TEL was about trying to really make a transformation in the way that we train teachers for basic schools. And one reason why I stayed in Ghana, one reason why I really enjoyed it, was that it was very much led by the government of Ghana. Sometimes when you do these programs, you feel like the donor is imposing on the government and the government doesn't really want it. It's just doing it for the money. But that was not the case at all. It was very clear that the ministry, under the leadership of Dr. Akuapim and with Dr. Adachum as the deputy minister, were very, very committed to totally changing the way that we train teachers. Yeah. They recognized that chewing, pouring, passing, and forgetting is the disease that's kind of infiltrated our entire education system. And so what we were trying to do with the colleges of education was to introduce a much more practically focused vocational type training, and then uplifting it from a diploma in basic education to a bachelor's of education degree. Because in Ghana, in the past, as in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, children that do well at senior high school, that get good grades, they want to go to university. Children that don't do so well, they want to go and do teacher training. So by raising the standard to a bachelor's degree, by changing the assessment system to make it much more practically focused, you can't chew, pour, pass and forget your way to be a teacher now, Stephen. You have to practically demonstrate that you can teach well. And so that's what the program was doing. And it started in 2015. I joined it in 2017. It got extended until 2020. And the government of Ghana really valued the work that we were doing. Another point I should say, Stephen, is that one of the things that I did when I joined was to look at how we could make sure that all of our technical advisors were Ghanaian. So, I mean, so the second reason why I love the program is that I think Ghana is a country that has a great deal of potential to change. Certainly, if I look at the 11 countries across sub-Saharan Africa where I've worked, Ghana feels to me to be the one that has the most potential to really make a big shift in the way that we conceive and the way that we operate teaching and learning. So we made sure that we all had Ghanaian experts, Ghanaian advisors. All the materials were written by the tutors from the colleges of education or the universities. And Dr. Akuapim and the government of Ghana really wanted this support to continue. And so they asked the Mastercard Foundation whether they would be interested in funding T-TEL. And Mastercard Foundation said they would be interested in funding T-TEL, but they couldn't fund Cambridge Education because of its status as a foreign profit-making company. Yeah. And at that moment, that's when we decided to create T-TEL as a Ghanaian not-for-profit organization. So, yeah.
That is really interesting to hear. I like that you start from T-TEL as a project and how it was very much government-led and informed by the priorities of government, but also has a huge buy-in from government stakeholders to the extent that they would want the project to continue and will make efforts to secure funding for it to continue. And I think that on ownership, I think that is really impressive that local actors and stakeholders take some ownership and strong interest in the project. So thank you very much for sharing that. I have two follow-ups based on what you've said. You've already mentioned that a lot of your technical advisors, all of your technical advisors and the people who work on the program, technically, a lot of them are Ghanaians. I think that with T-TEL starting as a Cambridge Education funded project, there are critics who argue that any form of external assistance may impose Western ideals and practices on local contexts, leading to the loss of cultural identity. So I would want to find out, apart from what you've mentioned, what aspect of the T-TEL program addresses these concerns and ensure that the programs are locally or contextually relevant and rooted. And the second follow-up question is, what has been the main difference in the shift between T-TEL as a Cambridge Education-backed project and T-TEL as a locally registered organization?
Yeah, so I think to answer the first question, I recognize that. I really recognize what you're saying. But with FCDO, the people that we had in FCDO at the time, we never really felt that anything was being imposed upon us. and again, with the ministry leading.
Yeah.
But I have to say, becoming a local NGO has been liberating, Stephen. It's been really, really liberating. It has opened my eyes to a lot of things, because I've worked in international education for a long time. And it's only when that you're working for a Ghanaian organization. Our board is entirely Ghanaian. Professor Anamwa Mensah is our chair. We have people like Professor Rita Akosua-Dixon, Professor Kwame Achempong, Sister Elizabeth, the former principal of Walewale College of Education, Professor George Odro. We've got a fantastic board. They keep me on my toes. It was only when we became a Ghanaian organization that I started to feel and sense the way that some actors in the aid community talk down to local organizations. And I think they do it in a way that isn't even deliberate. It's become so ingrained, this idea that you can have a Ghanaian scope of knowledge, but it has to fit within this international scope of best practice. And you're allowed to, it's infected a lot of what we do. We assume that American universities or European universities are better than Ghanaian universities, and it kind of means that we downplay what we're doing in Ghana. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have such a drive and having so many people that want to leave the country, to be honest. And I think it starts with education, trying to get that sense of identity back. And I think that's what T-TEL has really helped us to do, because I've felt so proud of my board. We're very, very careful about the funders that we work with. At this point, we haven't taken any funding from a bilateral government, because, as you know, at times that funding can be connected to certain things that country would want to see. So with the Mastercard Foundation as our funder, we've never once had the sense that they're imposing anything. They've been very, very respectful. I think Mastercard Foundation is a model foundation in many ways, in terms of how their leadership is rooted in the African continent, how they now have this rule that every board meeting they have has to take place a different location in Africa, and they were actually in Ghana last month. And then Jacobs Foundation as well. We found Jacobs Foundation to be very respectful. And one of the moments that made me proudest in T-TEL is where we turned down a grant, quite a large grant, from a European university, because they wanted us to be gathering data that they would then analyze and publish abroad. And Professor Anamwa Mensah said, this is wrong. This is not what we want to be involved with as T-TEL. So we see our role as T-TEL as showing that a Ghanaian organization can deliver world-class technical assistance. A Ghanaian organization can deliver and support these multi-million-dollar programs that otherwise you'd be getting American and European consultants in to do. And the danger with that is we become complacent. We start to believe our hype and how good we are. So we do make use of international experts, but we have them in a very much a backstopping point of view. So we will do the work in Ghana. We'll have them as critical friends to critique what we're doing. So it's trying to flip the power dynamic, and it's not always easy. And I know that there will be international organizations that will look at us and not be happy that we're upsetting the power dynamic. There'll be organizations that want us to fail. Because it's flipping the traditional donor model. And that's why we have to be incredibly careful with the way that we work, particularly when it comes to internal audit, use of funds, because you can just tell, Stephen, people are saying, they're a Ghanaian organization. Of course they couldn't do this. Of course there was fraud. So we try to set really high standards. And the other thing that we try to do is to not publicize ourselves. This is quite rare that I'm doing a podcast with you. And I'm doing it out of the respect that I have for you, Stephen, and the work that you're doing. Because for us, it's about putting government first. Our role is to support government. Anything that we do in Ghana is supporting the Ghana Education Service. It's supporting the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment. It's supporting the National Teaching Council. And even though our work is by definition projects, we don't want the schools and the institutions to know that it's projects, because one thing we've done in this country, we've projectized everything. So any assistance that comes, we see it as a project. We don't see it as part of the system. So I see our job as T-TEL as being to support the government of Ghana, whichever party's in power, to achieve the objectives that they have, to support them with technical advice, to help them secure financing from donors who maybe wouldn't give money directly to government, and to help them improve the quality, because we spend an enormous amount of money on education every year in this country, but a lot of it goes into salaries, recurrent costs, infrastructure. And so we don't have much funding left to deal with the quality aspect, the curriculum development aspect. And that's where an organization like T-TEL comes in. And if the government ever says to us, look, you're not doing things right, we don't think this is the right way, then we'll stop, we won't do it.
I hear systems thinking and systems strengthening from what you're saying with government first and the priorities of government. But I like the point you made about looking at it not just as a project, but as a continuous system-wide change that happens at all levels. I really like that you keep emphasizing the fact that it's led by government. Also, thanks a lot for sharing that, Robin.
No, you're welcome. You're welcome. And I actually find that it's universities where you have the very worst of this kind of colonial type thinking. Actually, it's worse than in many development agencies, and I think it's just become so ingrained. And as an organization, we're Ghanaians. This is our home. We employ 72 staff in T-TEL. I'm the only person that isn't a Ghanaian, and you can tell from the way that I'm talking that I think I'm a Ghanaian. My citizenship is on the way. We care deeply about our reputation. We care deeply about what happens with education here, and we want the system to succeed. You'll be really excited to hear that NACA have written a new curriculum. 300 Ghanaians have been involved in writing this. It's been very, very consultative. And I was actually just looking at the history curriculum just this afternoon with the head of Walewale Senior High.
Yeah.
And it corrects that. The new senior high school curriculum in history starts from prehistory, the prehistory of Ghana, pre-colonial times in Ghana, right? All of these, and it builds it all from Ghana's perspective. And if we look at the secondary education curriculum that's been written, it's what we call global. So it's not totally focused on Ghana, but it's taking Ghana as its starting point to then look out and engage with the rest of the world. And I honestly believe that our education system has played a really important role in kind of brainwashing us to thinking that Ghana is inferior, that the Ghanaian languages are inferior, that Ghanaian culture is inferior. And that's one of the things, as I said, that's driving everybody wanting to go abroad. I'm trying to do a PhD at UCC. I say trying because I'm not doing very well at it. But people say, oh, why am I doing a PhD at a Ghanaian university? Well, because I believe, for what I'm studying, the quality of the teaching and the learning that I'm getting at University of Cape Coast, why would I go to Europe or America to get that? But you have this belief that foreign things are better. It's a problem.
Yeah. I mean, that is really a strong point. I think that education and the education that we have been receiving does play a strong role in making us see ourselves as inferior, not just at a country level, but generally in African countries. Because when I was in school and my teachers were giving examples, they'll tell you that in Ghana it's like this, but when you travel abroad, it's like this. And they kind of paint a really perfect picture of what is outside, and then always contrast that with the gloomy side of Ghana that makes everyone wants to run away from the country. So I think it's essential that we begin to tweak our curriculum, we begin to shape education in a way that boosts our sense of national pride, make us be happy, know that we have the people, we have the human resources, and we can put ourselves to work to get to where we want to get to. I would jump into your programs. And what I noticed from browsing through your programs is that every single one of them is preceded by, this is a Government of Ghana program. This is a Government of Ghana program implemented or led by either the Ministry of Education and the Ghana Education Service. And I can see that this is like really led by government and it's not externally driven. And I think that that embeddedness and allowing the administration, the local stakeholders or the biggest stakeholders to take charge, implement projects, and providing that technical support is something that I see running through all your programs. That I'd want us to delve a little bit into each of them. I see 4 of them, but there's a chance to talk about more. I would want you to very briefly talk about the challenge, the solution, and if there's any outcomes that you're beginning to see in relation to the programs that you run. The first that I see is the secondary education reform, which is also called the Leaders in Teaching. Can you give us a synopsis of the program?
Yeah, so this is by far the largest program that we are supporting at the moment. In fact, really, Stephen, there's only two programs of any scale that I think it's probably worth talking about in this podcast. The first is the secondary education reform, and the second is communities of excellence. I think the others are quite small and inconsequential. But if we look at the secondary education reform, what this is doing, so I talked at the start about the reforms in teacher education. Yeah. And the reforms in teacher education have been recognized as being very successful. We have data on that. We know that the proportion of beginning teachers meeting the national teacher standards has increased from less than 2% in 2015 to well over 40% in 2021. And we know that when the first batch of bachelors of education degree teachers enter the classrooms, that 40 will increase even further. So the idea is, can we use the same theory of change that helped to make the teacher education reform successful to look at similar reforms in senior high schools? So that means looking at a new curriculum that's much more practically focused, much more Ghanaian focused, looking at assessment linked to the curriculum, because assessment, from my experience, drives a lot of behavior in the classroom. Yeah. Can we look at building up the leadership of these senior high schools, because senior high schools are similar in size to colleges of education? So can we look at building the strength of the leadership so they become leadership focused organizations? And can we do all of that within a very tight performance management framework overseen by GES districts and regions, so that they're getting real-time data as to how things are going? So the first part of that reform was writing a new secondary education curriculum. That's been completed. The next step is to roll that curriculum out effectively. And the international panel of experts who looked at the curriculum, chaired by Professor Kwame Achampong, who, as you know, is a very prominent Ghanaian educationalist. Again, you see, we're getting around this view that international means non-Ghanaian. Ghanaians can be international as well. They said that this curriculum is very, very ambitious, focused on 21st century skills, values, competencies, trying to promote critical thinking and problem solving. Because when we've done baseline assessments of Ghanaian students against 21st century skills, it's critical thinking and problem solving where they always score low. So the question is, so they've said it's very ambitious. They said it's similar in the ambition to what South Africa did under Nelson Mandela a number of years ago. But they cautioned us that in South Africa, the curriculum reforms didn't really succeed because the teachers didn't fully understand what it was that they were teaching. So the challenge for us in Ghana over the next 18 months before this curriculum goes live in October 2024 is, can we work with the teachers so that they understand it and embrace it? And that's why we've set up these weekly professional learning community sessions in schools. So we started to roll them out with GES in last month. So all 700 senior high schools, senior high technical schools are running those sessions every week, structured materials, and that is going to be the delivery mechanism by which they learn about the new curriculum. At the same time, GES has worked with all the schools to make sure they have school improvement plans. They're in place. We'll be monitoring achievement of that in a real-time basis. There'll be some results-based financing rewards for some of the more challenged schools that more resource-poor schools, to help them to implement those plans. But in a nutshell, that's what we're trying to do. And also, because we believe in systems reform, that will also involve working with NASIA to look at the way that they're inspecting schools, working with NTC, with the training, working with National Service to make sure that any service personnel who are posted to senior high schools have mandatory pedagogy training, because every year we send subject specialists from university to senior high schools without that pedagogy training. So that's something that's being put in place. And then also working with GTEC, NTC and the universities to reform the way that we train teachers for senior high schools. And then the final component, which I'd forgotten initially, but which is really important, is called Motivate. So again, when we do assessments, we see that in general, the teaching workforce in Ghana is not particularly motivated. And that's a problem if you're looking at a large-scale reform program. So conducting research with with GES, with NTC, to really try to find out what are the factors that are leading teachers to not feel motivated. And I know that salary will be part of it, but motivation goes way beyond salary. There's all sorts of evidence about intrinsic motivation, purpose, autonomy, mastery being important. So we want to look very systematically with GES and NTC at what are those factors, what are the things that we can put in place to improve teacher motivation. So that's what the secondary education reform program is. Highly ambitious, but I'm increasingly confident that it's deliverable, and I'm increasingly confident that we're going to see a really, really fundamental change in our secondary education system. And the teachers that have been trialing the new curriculum, they've really embraced it. I think, Stephen, it's as if we all know that what we're doing is not entirely right at the moment, that it's too examination focused, that just having a single exam at the end of 3 years is not the right thing. And the examination system will still continue in many ways, but it will be tweaked to look at transcripts, to look at more formative assessment that's happening in the schools, to look at annual assessment. And I'm very confident that Ghana can lead the way here, and we can really show the rest of sub-Saharan Africa that it is possible to deliver these kind of reforms, and to deliver them, with solely Ghanaian technical expertise as well.
I was in the Ghana learning section yesterday, Ghana education learning section, and one of the things that was said is the South African curriculum and changes that was introduced but did not do well. And I think it's interesting that you refer to that. I agree with what you said about this being ambitious, and Kwame, Professor Kwame Acheampong, who I revere so much, mentioned. But listening to you, I think what I really like is that, this reform, or this policy reform, is a big picture, ambitious 21st century skills that you want to introduce, but there's often a complex gap between policy and practice, and how the reform actually leads to actual change on the grounds. But what I noticed is that beyond the reform, as part of the reform, you are putting in place robust plans and policy, or what we would call policy considerations, creating the enabling environment and the conditions that will make the reform successful, with the rollout, the teacher involvement in the professional learning communities, developing school improvement plans, making sure that we let go of the assumption that anyone at all, as long as they have some education, can go into the classroom to teach without any pedagogical training, and also looking at how we motivate teachers to own their job, be interested in teaching, but also see room for continuous professional growth. And I think it looks impressive and promising, especially that it is beyond the goals that we are trying to achieve. We're making the hard work, or the background work that will make it possible. So I do hope that this is realized, because it has enormous potential for transforming teaching and education in Ghana. Thanks a lot for sharing on the reform. Can we
You're welcome, Stephen. Just an additional point. I think that a lot of reforms fail because people think that the solution is purely technical, but it isn't. And that is the big mistake I see with many donor-funded programs. They feel that, right, the issue here is a lack of skills. So I have a mentor, Ray Shostak. He was my boss in the Prime Minister's delivery unit. And he's somebody that gives me very good critical advice whenever I ask for it. He's one of the cleverest people I've ever met. And he has a very fantastic talent in simplifying things. And he said to me, when he was looking at what we're doing in Ghana, he said, look, Robin, don't overcomplicate it. Educational improvement, he said, whether it's at a school level, whether it's at a district level, whether it's at a national level, it comes down to only two things. And those things are culture and skills. So by culture, do you have a school that is focused on learning, that everybody in that school understands that their primary purpose, the reason for being there, is learning, and shifting the learning outcomes for individual students? Yeah. Do you have staff who are using data effectively to monitor learning? Do you have staff who feel a sense of pride in the vision and mission of what's going on? And then alongside that, you need the skills, because you can have the culture, but if you don't have the pedagogy, if you don't have the curriculum content understanding, you're not going to deliver improvement. So it's those two things, culture and skills. And if I look at what's happened in Ghana, we focus very, very much on the skills. with donor-funded programs, and we haven't looked at the culture. And for me, we haven't looked enough at the culture. So for me, education reform, it's part technical, but it's mostly political. And I don't mean big P party political. It's about understanding the incentives and the motivations that people in the system have. It's about trying to look ahead to see where the potential blockers of progress are, and then putting in measures in place early, years ahead. So by the time you get to that point, you've overcome the resistance that you were going to find. And a reform like this, communications is absolutely key. We're supporting the ministry with a weekly talk show on education, EduTalk, that's going to be starting next month, and other communications activities. The unions are very heavily involved. We've taken time to ensure that the views of NAGRA, NAT, and others are heavily involved. So yeah, I think this can succeed.
Yeah, thank you very much. I am quite hopeful that it succeeds as well, because this holds a lot of promise, and you're obviously putting in a lot of work into this. I think I do like that you are involved in the people who make this possible, like the teachers, the teacher unions, because a huge number of reforms have failed because it's failed to get the buy-in of these relevant stakeholders. Let's jump quickly to the Communities of Excellence program, which will be the last one we discussed. Can you tell us about the challenge that you've identified and the solution that you are implementing with the government on the Communities of Excellence program?
Sure. So again, the Communities of Excellence is something where the conception, the idea came very much from the Ministry of Education, from GES. And the basic premise behind it is, if you look over the years, Stephen, we seem to have lost a lot of community engagement in education. If I go back even 20, 23 years when I was teaching in Ghana, teaching seemed to be a more respected profession than it is nowadays. And in many ways, when we look at government schools, issues of teacher attendance, issues of pastoral care in those schools, those are all issues which are better solved in the community or by the school management committee than are solved by the hierarchy. And we end up with a very hierarchical system. The former Director General of GES had a very good thing he used to say, where he said, look, it's not fair to compare private schools and government schools in Ghana, because we don't have chains of private schools. Private schools are owned by, they have an individual owner. So if a problem happens in a private school, the owner addresses that problem. If a problem happens in a school in Chereponi, for example, it will go from the school to the CISO, from the CISO to the district education office, from the district to the region. And then he said, eventually it will land on my desk as Director General.
Yeah.
And he said, by the time it's happened, like the problem's gone, right? Something else has happened. So the idea behind Communities of Excellence is, can we get back this sense that it isn't just the responsibility of teachers to educate the students, but it's a responsibility of the community and everybody within the district. And if you look at the amount of money that we spend as Ghanaians on private basic schools, where we know that the quality of teachers in private basic schools is not as good as the quality of teachers in our government schools. And I say that as someone that's visited quite a few private schools, in Accra in particular. We need to work on the culture side of things. So Communities of Excellence is starting from the point of view that the people who know best about their children's education are in the district. So we're not prescribing a central solution. We're not sitting in Accra saying that you have to do this.
Yeah.
What we do is facilitate a problem-solving process. So it's a set of techniques called managing for learning. And what will happen, and anybody can use them, they're very helpful. You go into a district, you speak to the community leaders, and then they assemble groups of learners, groups of teachers, groups of parents, groups of traditional leaders, and then you work over a number of days to help them identify what are the issues, what are the big issues in education in their district, and which of those issues are within their control. Yeah. So something like, so if they've got a problem with the curriculum, there's not a great deal they can do about the curriculum, to be fair. So we use this matrix to start to show them what they can do. But what happens is communities start to realize that they are responsible for a lot more than they thought they were.
Yeah.
Then you look at providing them with funding to develop a plan. So with Jacobs Foundation, we worked in Akuapim South, Lambussie, Basomefreo. We set aside $100,000 for each district, Stephen, under GES. And GES said to the district, we have confidence, put together your plan. Put together your plan about what you want to do. And then with GES, we would go about making sure that it was implemented. There have been some challenges along the way. There've really been some challenges. I feel that districts and stakeholders are better at analyzing problems than they were at solving problems. And in some cases, they were defaulting to the traditional kind of project mentality. So, Stephen, if we've got a problem with teachers, we'll give them some training. So we'll call them out, we'll give them a boar fruit and a meat pie and some sobolo, and we'll pay them transport. And then nothing really changes. So it's been trying to shift the mentality to, can we do this teacher improvement in the schools? Can we maximize the resources? So you can use money on furniture, you can use money on textbooks. But that program's been running for just over a year. We've got the first annual evaluation this month. But even anecdotally, we're seeing that it's really strengthening community involvement and district oversight and accountability. There's also a strong data focus. So it's about providing CISOs with funding to go and do monitoring, but then they have to have these tablets to observe lessons. So it identified a number of issues and it's going well. I mean, a team from the Open University were out in Akuapim South last month seeing what's going on. We've seen communities raising funds to repair schools and things. So it's something, the funding for it at the moment is a little bit uncertain. I'm not sure where we're going to get the next tranche of funding from, but I think we've certainly set something in motion that has a lot of potential to work in basic education, because as T-TEL, we haven't done a great deal of work in basic education. The theory of change that we used in colleges of education, I think you can use them in secondary schools. I don't think you can use that same theory of change in basic schools in Ghana, because there's so many of them and the schools are so small. So there has to be a different way. And I think managing for learning, trying to get more problem solving, local accountability is maybe one of the ways we can do that.
Yeah. I mean, in my work in rural communities, I have seen excellent examples of how community members and stakeholders unite, sometimes take money from their own resources to solve problems when they are invested in it. And I think I agree with you that there's been that kind of divide between the school and the community, and everything has been more of centralized. And so this is sounds like a wonderful project, bringing community back into the school and bringing the school to the community. And I think that this will generally enhance the community responsibility and ownership. And I did like the point about resource and CISOs as well, because that has been a huge challenge for them. But giving community voice some room, autonomy and funding. Relating to this, I did meet someone from JICAP last week, and they were talking about a Compass project that was community participation for sustainable schools for all. I think it's kind of a similar idea, trying to increase community participation. So I think, there may be room for concerted effort in getting this. There may be different geographical focuses, but I think that this seems like a wonderful idea, and other actors are taking it up as well. I do really hope you find funding to continue with this promising initiative. You have mentioned some really inspiring things that I am particularly very proud of myself. I wonder if there are any one or two projects or achievements that you are particularly personally very proud of.
So I think the thing that I'm proudest of in Ghana is the new BEd, the new Bachelor's of Education degree, and changes that will bring about in our basic school classrooms. We often talk teachers down, and you saw the news article that was out about NTC and how many people were failing the licensure without being given any context that people that were failing the licensure were people that were resitting for the third or fourth time. And I think that's something that we often do to our education system. But what Ghana has achieved in teacher education, what the 46 colleges and the 5 universities have achieved, I think it's nothing short of remarkable. And there are 16,000 beginning teachers coming out now every year who understand learner-centered pedagogy, who understand the new curriculum. And I think over the next 4 or 5 years, when they start to go into our basic school classrooms and start to really build a critical mass, I think we're going to see massive improvements
Yeah.
And for me, the moment that just was a kind of the proudest moment of all was when I was in Gambaga College of Education in 2021. And there's a course that's put on in the BEd called The Intersection of Physical Education, Music and Dance. And it's recognizing that from a Ghanaian perspective, music is incredibly culturally important. And music is one way in which you learn about your body and how physical education works. And so this course had been designed, and it was the end of semester assessment. And the whole community had come out, because the end of semester assessment, the student teachers had been split into groups of 10, and each group had been given a different Ghanaian traditional dance. And they had to come out, they had to give an oral presentation on the history of the dance, they had to wear the costumes, and then they had to perform the dance. And so their end of semester mark was based on that. And I was thinking, wow, in the past, first of all, they probably wouldn't even have been taught this. And if they had been taught it, it would just be chewing and pouring to write it down on a...
It's a question for me.
But now, I think, and they were taking it all so seriously. There was a panel from the college and from UDS who were marking them. And I think when those student teachers get into the basic school classroom, they're going to see this as a legitimate way of teaching, and they are going to be teaching their students in the same way. So for me, that is the thing that I'm proudest of. And I'd say maybe the thing that I'm second proudest of is establishing T-TEL as a Ghanaian organization. It's the best job I could ever wish for. And if we can show that a Ghanaian NGO can deliver world-class services, then it opens up a lot of possibilities for us to start to kind of reclaim that space in terms of technical advice and technical assistance. And yes, there's a role for international technical advice. There's a role for international technical assistance, but don't see us as inferior. Don't relegate us to working within your framework. So for me, those are the two things.
Yeah. That's interesting. I feel like I wish I were there to witness the Gambaga College of Education show. It feels like a really entertaining time, but also really practical, and the fact that it's being taken seriously. There isn't much time, and so I would end with just one last question before we close this. And oftentimes when I read about education in Ghana, but in other places, there seem to be agreement that Ghana is making significant progress in improving access to education in terms of enrollment. Obviously, we still have problems with out-of-school children, especially west in cocoa growing areas, but historically or progressively, we are making some progress in terms of access, but not as much progress with quality and equity, which remain challenges. I want to know your view on this, and what are your key recommendations for ensuring quality education beyond access, but also promoting equity?
So I think on quality, part of the reason why we're better access than quality, and I'll talk about equity in a minute, but part of the reason why is because you can measure access more simply. We have a system which is very focused on quantitative measurement. So if you look at an annual district education operational plan, there will be targets in there about enrollment. There'll be targets about number of teachers, about books, and then there'll also be targets about quality. But the quality targets are number of teachers trained. And you can't measure quality with number of teachers trained, because it puts an incentive into the system to just train 200 teachers as cheaply as you can. So you can write a report saying, I trained 200 teachers. Yeah, you trained 200 teachers, but what actually changed? What improvements? So it's about trying to get a measurement system which is measuring learning much more on a regular, ongoing, formative basis, measuring teachers, because we have the national teacher standards in Ghana. We're very fortunate to have a document like the national teacher standards. So in fact, one of the things we've done in communities of excellence is to set up a monitoring system based around adherence to the national teacher standards. So the district is saying, okay, this year, we know that only 15% of our teachers are meeting the standard on assessment. We want to get that to 45%. Now, that's a very different conversation, Stephen, about what you do in the district compared to the quantitative target. So I think we need to shift our whole system to be looking at measuring quality in more meaningful ways. And then the issue of equity is really one that disturbs me a lot, particularly as an adopted Northerner. You know, I see all the time that the curriculum that we're rolling out, the foundation just isn't here in many schools in the North. And I think the answer to that is to try to make sure that all the time when we're making policy, when we're making resourcing decisions, that we have that awareness of what's actually going on in the ground. And I'll give you a very practical example. We were in Lambussie in January, up in Upper West, and we had a lot of big people from the Ghanaian education system there. And we were going to lessons, and we were seeing these very bright young teachers who were trying to teach primary too, but they only spoke Akan, and they didn't speak Sisala, or they didn't speak Dagari. And so how can you teach effectively? And we were there with the executive director of the National Service Scheme, who's a very, very forward-looking person, director of schools and instruction from GES. And we've committed that this year, when Ghana is posting service personnel to basic schools, we're taking language of instruction into account. So if you speak Sisala, you're going to get posted to that area. And it's hard. And that's one of the issues of equity. I think the language issue is a major issue because you have so many smaller languages, particularly in the North. So that's a practical example of how we can, at a national level, start to address equity just by being aware of some of the issues that are happening. And it seems like an obvious thing to do, Stephen, posting based on language, but it isn't a data field that the National Service have been collecting before. So I think the more that we can do that, the more that we can bring exposure to some of these issues, the more that we can get policymakers from Accra to be spending time in these communities. I'm a big believer. My house in Wulugu, where I'm talking from now in the Northeast region, I've brought a number of people from the Ministry of Education here to stay here so that they can just experience what it's like in a rural community in the north of Ghana. I think then people will start to take those things into account when they're making decisions.
Yeah, I really like the last point. I feel like I did type or write on that I feel like anyone who gets into a high-level position in education must kind of take a reality tour of the situation on the ground, understanding when they go back to their work that these are the people you are serving, these are some of the conditions, these are the language barriers you're talking about, these are issues that are real. And so they're making decisions with that understanding in mind. And I often want to believe that people who have been exposed to certain realities are more minded and have that shape their decision making as compared to people who haven't. But you have said a lot of insightful things in your response. I do like the shedding light on the fact that quality as compared to access is more difficult to measure. And so the challenge here is developing a reliable way of measuring quality as compared to just crunching the numbers to get issues of access. Thank you very, very much for those responses. I have enjoyed this conversation and have learned quite a few things from what you have said. I think what stands out to me from talking to you on this podcast is the real strong passion for transforming education outcomes. And I think that a lot more people like you and a lot more organizations like T-TEL are needed in the education space, not just in Ghana, but other countries, filled with people who really want to see learning outcomes improve, want to see tangible change, and would go the length and breadth to see that happen. On this note, I'd say we would come to the end of the interview, but before I let you go, if you have any last words that you want to share, particularly for our listeners who have enjoyed this conversation and are interested in, well, I'm listening, I'm a parent, I'm a teacher, what can I do? What will be your last words to at the end?
Thank you. I mean, thank you for inviting me, Stephen. I've enjoyed talking to you. I think it's very interesting that you mentioned the issue of parents, because I think often we overlook the role of parents when we're looking at the education system as a whole. We looked at Lambussie, Akuapim South, Bosome Freo. We did an evaluation. The performance of teachers was relatively similar in all the three districts. The learning outcomes in Akuapim South were far higher than they were in Lambussie, and Bosome Freo was somewhere in the middle. But then we also interviewed parents, and we interviewed parents across all 3 districts.
Yeah.
And the percentage of parents that supported their children's education, the percentage of parents that wanted their children to go to tertiary education was exactly the same across all 3 districts. Where there was a really big difference was the percentage of parents who supported their children to do homework at home. And I think in Akuapim South, it was about 70, 75%. In Lambussie, it was as low as, I think, between 15 and 20%. And that isn't the fault of the Lambussie parents. It's because the Lambussie parents are not literate by and large. And so the greatest gift that you could give as a parent is supporting your child at home with reading and writing and homework. And that's a massive missing part of the picture when we look at government policy. And it's a part that we need to pay attention to. And actually, I firmly believe that a lot of parents who are sending their children to private school, those children would succeed in public school, because the reason they're succeeding is because they've got a parent who's literate and who cares about them. So I'd ask you to think about the support that you're giving to your child. And I'm sure anyone listening to this podcast will already be supporting their child. I'd ask them to look at taking a chance on a government basic school with these new teachers that we have, because it's your impact. It's your impact as looking at the homework and all those things that is really making a difference. So yeah, that would be my final thought.
Thank you so much for that. We are indeed all involved in building our motherland. On this note, enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for speaking with us. Until next time, this is the Let's Talk Education Africa podcast.